Hey, welcome to Rob Paints Models. In today's video I'm going to be showing you how to paint aged leather. Now this is only going to use 4 paints, no washes. And we're going to start with base coating all of our leather areas with Rhinox hide. This will take 2 to 3 thin coats to cover nice and smooth. You want a nice smooth coat to work over. So I'm not going to show you that, that's quite boring. The first real stage is I'm going to be using a Scrag Brown, and I'm going to be using a very fine brush. I'm using a size 1 Broken Toad Mark II here, but the finer the brush the better. And you want to water this down so that it's at a relatively kind of thin consistency. You don't want it to be too translucent, you want it to cover in like one go. And we're just going to use the edge of the brush and we're just going to go around, we're going to edge highlight all of our leather areas all the way around. Now if you've ever looked at leather up close, like cracked, aged leather, like a leather belt or something, or a bag, you'll note that where it starts to crack, you can actually see through the shiny brown surface where it's been tanned into the inside of the leather, and that's usually kind of a more orange tone, going through to a kind of yellowy ivory type colour, depending upon how much damage that has occurred. And that's what we're trying to simulate here. The edge highlights aren't actually edge highlights. This is damage and texture and weather on the edges of the leather here. So anywhere where there's a fold in the leather, anywhere that it might have been caught or where damage might occur, you want to paint this on there. So the top of that flap on that holster, for example, is a really good area where you would get a lot of wear and tear from opening and closing the holster. The leather would crack and start to warp and become damaged over time. Also around the corners you'd get more damage and it would kind of tear up and snarl up a bit more as it goes on. So as you can see, I've done it on all of the different leather pouches and the leather belt on this marine, and this would work on anyone, not just Space Marines. Anybody that's got leather on, go for it. So now I'm using that same Scrag Brown and I'm using a kind of tapping motion to create more texture along those edges. This creates very small kind of imperfections in that edge highlight, so it's not a perfectly straight line, but instead it looks a bit ragged, and this again creates the illusion of that damage and tearing and cracking that we're looking for in our aged leather. So I'm just going to be doing that, going all the way around all of those edges. On some of the edges I'm going to do it a little bit more than others. For example, the top hinge of that flap, I'm going to be a little heavier with my damaging and weathering on the area than everywhere else, because again that will be opening and closing a lot, causing the leather to crack. So now I'm going to be using the same Scrag Brown mix again, and this time I'm painting very fine lines. I'm starting from the where I want the line to end and moving towards the edge of the holster here, and occasionally just splotching it on by accident, but that's okay because it all just adds to the overall texture. So I'm going to do a few of these long scratches and long cracks in the leather here, and then I'm just going to kind of dab and make some little mottled speckled patches using a kind of pointillism type motion, just kind of tapping with the tip of the brush in order to create more damage and weather and texture in the surface of our leather. And don't worry if it looks a bit too harsh at the moment, we're going to go through some glazes later and we're going to tone it all down. So I can see here, just using the very tip of my brush to create some very fine lines. And this just takes practice. So as you can see, I've gone around and I've done it to all of the different pouches and bags here. And it's looking a bit over the top and a bit harsh at the moment, but that's fine. Next we're going to use some Ushabti bone, and again this has been thinned down just to the point where it's flowing off the brush but it's not speeding off the brush. And I'm going to be using a tapping motion with the very tip of the brush along all of the edges in order to create that very extreme wear that goes along those edges and the sides of the leather. So anywhere again where there's a fold, where there's an exposed edge or side of the leather, you want this to occur. So if you take a leather belt, look at it front on, you can see the brown, then you get a little bit of the cracks with the orangey colour. Turn it to the side, you'll see the actual colour of the leather, of the untanned leather, and that is usually a much lighter colour than the surface of the leather, and that's what we're trying to simulate here along a lot of those edges, but also where the leather cracks across harsh edges like this. Like a 90-degree corner for leather is going to get a lot of wear on it, and it's going to get damaged, and it's going to crack, and it's going to expose the raw leather underneath the tanned leather surface. So again, the tapping motion creates that appearance of tiny tears and just a small amount of damage that has occurred, so that it's not a uniform line. If it was a perfectly straight line, it would look a bit weird, but the tapping motion adds a lot of texture to this and is really what sells the effect. So you can see here, going all the way down this long edge, I'm focusing it a little bit more towards the corners and not so much in the middle. And this is why it's important to have a very fine pointed brush, but also one that's got a fairly decent amount of flex in it so that you can use a light touch. If your brush has got a very stiff tip to it, then it has a tendency not to flex as much, and you can kind of get more paint onto the model than you actually intended. Whereas if it's got a decent amount of flex, which these broken toed brushes do, then you've actually got a fair amount of give, so that you can, if you press a bit too hard, the bristles flex and don't let you apply too much paint. So that's why I find these brushes in particular really good for this kind of technique, and that's why I prefer them for doing edge highlights and anything that involves tapping on an edge. These brushes are great for it. Glazing and painting large areas, not so much, but for this kind of work, they're excellent. This is probably the most time-consuming part of this process, because you want to go around and you want to catch pretty much every single edge that's on the leather for this. And how much you do this is going to determine how old and weathered and damaged your leather looks. I was going for a pretty old, damaged look here on this leather. But if you do this less and just like veer towards the scrag brown end a bit more, it doesn't look quite as old and quite as worn. So none of this footage is sped up either, so you're getting the full real-time experience. I am wearing a head magnifier while I do this. Any head magnifier will do. I'm using one with 1.8 times magnification, just so that I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. My eyes aren't what they used to be. And once you've done it all, you can go around, see? It's looking quite good, but we're not done. Not yet. I mean, if you wanted to, you could leave it here. Perfectly good. Tabletop ready. Job done. But we're going to take this a little bit further. So, if you make a mistake, just wipe it off with your finger. That's what I do. We're going to use the tip of our brush to create some little dots along where some of those orange, scrag brown coloured lines intersect with each other, or where we want to create the illusion of like a deeper crack or a full-on scratch that's gone down the leather, say from a knife or something, that's actually like gouged into the surface of the leather, revealing the raw leather underneath. So along the edges of the hinges, it's more that it's cracked and split through use, but along the flat surfaces it's more like, oh, someone's taken a swipe at you with a knife and it's hit there, or a ricochet's gone and just nicked the side of that leather pouch there. Again, just using the tip of your brush, being very careful just to make very tiny dots, very tiny thin lines. Again, practice a lot before doing this on your models. Just get a bit of plastic card, paint it brown, and then practice on that. So now I'm using some Rhinox hide, and this has been thinned down to a very thin glaze consistency. So you can see it's very translucent. We can see everything we've done underneath it here. And what I'm doing is I'm glazing from the edges of the leather in towards the middle. Now what this means is it will leave more pigment in the middle where you lift the brush off, and that will create a darker Rhinox hide colour there. And this essentially is blending all of our scratches and our damage out towards the middle. So in the middle of the leather, it's not as damaged because it's flat, it's not flexing as much. Whereas towards the edges, it would be more damaged. So we're using our glaze to just build that up, focusing it only in the center of each of the surfaces of the leather, and that will build up and create ourselves a nice kind of waxed over look. Now I mixed in a little bit of abandoned black into my Rhinox hide here, and I'm using this to do two things. One, I'm starting off with black lining around the folds in the leather, so where the flap of the holster meets the rest of the holster, that would have a gap in reality, so I'm painting a dark line there to create a shadow. I'm also creating shadows in the areas where light might not be reaching it as much. So for example, in the middle of the belt, all the way around there, and in the top kind of half of the holster, and you can see here on the pouch as well, just glazing it up towards the top of the pouch, because that will make it look like there's more light hitting the bottom edge where it kind of juts out from the body. And if in large areas like the holster, I just want it to be a little bit darker in the middle on that flat, just to give it a bit more depth. And that's what it looks like when you've done all of those glazes all the way around. Now I'm using some pure Abaddon black here, thinned down, and I'm just using this to create some little deeper nicks and tears, so giving it a little 3D effect by painting a kind of a shadow above some of the really deep tears on the leather. This gives it a three-dimensional look, makes it look like the tear has actually got depth to it rather than it's just a surface tear. I'm not doing this on a lot of them because I don't want this to be like, oh, this is just been carved up loads. I want this to look like, oh, a few tears are quite deep, but if you do too many of them, it looks really, really weird. And I'm just occasionally just tapping this some points on the edges just to make it look like, oh, well, that's a really big crack right there. And now I'm using some Shabti bone. I'm just tidying up the highlights underneath those shadows because I often do them a little bit too big. And I go back in with my lighter colour and just reinforce the highlight underneath there. And then just underneath that second highlight, I'm doing some scrag brown again. And this is just to kind of make it look like it's fading out, rolling over into the Rhinox hide. And again, just it's going back and forth, just some tiny little dots just to create a bit more texture along those scratches. You can do this as much as you want, go back and forth as much as you want at this stage. And when you're happy with it, just call it done. And that's it. That is how I paint aged leather. 4 paints, no washes. It takes me about an hour per Space Marine, roughly, to do all of the pouches on them. And there you go. So I hope you liked that video. I'll be doing more videos on specific topics in the future. They're much faster for me to edit, so I can get them done. Thank you to all of my patrons who you can see on the screen here. Without them, I wouldn't be able to keep making videos of all this tutorial content for YouTube. I'm sorry I haven't been doing as much as I normally would, but Golden Demon waits for no man and takes up all my time. So there's another video you can watch on the screen there. Check out my social medias. Subscribe. There's a button on the left there. And thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.